Hello and welcome to this video of Inside Stream. Today is 16th of August 2025 and this is my third video update of the day, and this will be the final video in the series of the Russian-American summit. Now in this video I will be talking about the European response to the summit. Before this summit had even started, there was some hope among the European nations, Kiev and other European capitals, that the various demands that are being placed upon Russia, at least some of them, if not all of them, may be accepted by the Russians, which after the press conference that was conducted after the completion of the meeting, it became very clear that the Russians haven't given a single inch of their ground. They have stood their ground, and the Americans seem to be receptive of the Russian position in the meeting, although the various intricate details still remain classified, or perhaps they may be released sooner or later. It is something that we look forward to. Now the European response, if we look, it seems to be very difficult for the Europeans to comprehend the fact that the Russians are not willing to compromise upon the situation, where the Europeans continue to constantly place demand after demand on the Russians to withdraw, to accept a ceasefire, to freeze the conflict, while at the same time they continue to impose economic sanctions on the Russian nation. The Europeans must have realized that all the way back in 2014, when the first Ukrainian crisis actually started, several sanctions were imposed by the Europeans on the Russians. Angela Merkel, leading the European nations, imposed various strict sanctions on Russian goods, services, imposed, but none of these worked. At the end of the day, had to visit Russia in order to resolve the crisis that was brewing in Ukraine. Now, moving forward to this day, the Europeans have still not yet learned that the sanctions regime doesn't work on the Russians. The European belief that the sanctions on Russia would compel the Russian nation, the Russian government, to accept their demands is somewhat illogical, as the Russians seem to be very focused. They seem to be in a position of strength. The Russian advantage in men and material is very evident on the front lines. The Russian economy continues to grow, while at the same time the Europeans are facing deindustrialization. There is a budgetary crisis in Europe, along with a political crisis in Europe, where latest surveys show that most of the European leaders that are leading the major economies of Europe are losing their popularity among the masses. Now, Kiev and other European capitals must have been furious and perhaps even dismayed, seeing that President Trump and President Putin holding a joint press conference, although no questions were taken from the reporters in this particular meeting. President Putin made several statements, which I have mentioned in my previous video, which President Trump seemed not to disagree with. Now, the statements have been criticized in the Western media, especially the European media, and in fact several press conferences have been organized by the European nations and their foreign ministries, criticizing the statements that have been made by President Putin in this particular summit. But President Trump didn't seem to be bothered, and in fact he also seemed to agree and somewhat sympathetic to the Russian position on this particular conflict. Now, it is very obvious that President Trump is willing to compromise for peace. President Trump knows that United States currently has a weaker strategic position in this conflict, and he also seems to realize that it is in US interest to make peace with the Russians and to move in a much more friendly manner in order to achieve economic progress for both the nations. USA My apologies. In the summit, the various objectives that have been stated by both the Americans and the Russians is about finding a common ground for peace, at the same time to find a permanent solution to this particular conflict. The Americans, although seem to be insisting upon the Ukrainian security concerns, President Putin has also accepted that the Ukrainian security concerns must be addressed, while at the same time, legitimate security concerns of Russia must also be addressed. President Putin talked about a security structure, a framework where the security interests of the Western nations, Russia, and the world as a whole must be understood, and that is something that cannot be compromised in interest or in favor of one particular nation from the West. During the press conference, President Putin also invited President Trump to visit Moscow in the next round of the summit, which is likely to be held in the month of September. And it is very evident from the political statements from the media, the European media, and the statements of the various foreign ministries that the Europeans are somewhat demoralized, and they also seem to be aware and realize that there is very little that they can do to influence this particular process as they face budgetary crisis, as they face deindustrialization, as they face political crisis, while at the same time Kiev seems to be struggling to hold the Russian army. President Zelensky is struggling to maintain his position of power in Ukraine, and at the same time Russians and Americans talking to each other is somewhat discouraging and demoralizing for all the Europeans who are fully aware of the fact that their influence on the Americans and the world as a whole is waning with every passing day. In fact, it has been stated by many political pundits that Europe has never been so irrelevant in the geopolitics than it is today. In past 600 years, Europe is losing its position in the world. Dollar is struggling. The Western world is deindustrializing, while at the same time, the BRICS nations continue to grow, continue to develop. Now, given all this particular situation that is developing all over the world, it is very likely that some new developments may take place in the coming days, which we will be looking forward to. So this is where I end my video for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Thank you.